Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 914.
Old footage online claims to show something impossible. A Pan Am airliner that took off in 1955, dropped off the radar, and landed 37 years later with everyone still frozen in the past. It never happened. No airline ever flew it.
Flight controllers frantically tried to communicate with the airplane. Nothing. What happened? How can you lose a jetliner? How can it vanish in thin air?
Chapter 1. The Flight That Never Was. The legend is very specific, and that's exactly why it sticks. On July 2, 1955, a Pan Am flight left New York for Miami with 57 passengers on board. Somewhere over the coast, it drops off the radar. No wreckage, no distress call, nothing at all. For 37 years, the plane is just gone, written off as one more thing lost at sea. Then, the story goes, it comes back. On a spring day in 1992, controllers at an airport in Caracas, Venezuela, watch a propeller plane line up for the runway. It's an old model, the kind that stopped flying years earlier. The pilot radios in and says he's Flight 914, ready to land in Miami. He sounds calm. That lasts right up until they tell him the city below him isn't Miami, and the year isn't 1955. People on the ground say they can see faces at the windows, passengers in decades-old clothes staring out at jets they don't recognize. Before anyone can get on board, the pilot pushes the throttle and climbs back into the clouds. On his way out, he drops one thing. A 1955 calendar fluttering down onto the tarmac. It's a perfect ghost story. It's also completely made up. The whole thing first ran in 1985 in a tabloid called the Weekly World News, the same paper that once sold readers a story about a man who sued himself. Flight 914 was just one more of those. There's no record of it anywhere. No airline logged that flight out of New York, and no passengers ever went missing. The photos were faked, and the witnesses were invented. The paper liked the story enough to run it again in the 1990s, and the internet did the rest. That clip you may have seen looks convincing, but it shows something that never happened. It fooled a lot of people for one simple reason. The thing underneath it is real. Planes really do leave the ground and never arrive. The difference is that the real cases don't end with a calendar on the runway. They end with a search, a long silence, and a question that outlives everyone who ever asked it. And one of the oldest of those questions is still sitting in the water off the coast of Florida.
The fact that the signal disappeared, that was the unusual element. The fact that transponder, which was chirping back every time it was hit by the radar beam from air traffic control, went silent.
Chapter 2. Vanishing Point. On the afternoon of December the 5th, 1945, 5 Navy torpedo bombers took off from Fort Lauderdale for a training run that should have taken about 3 hours. The lead pilot, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, had thousands of hours in the air behind him. About 90 minutes in, his compasses failed, and he became convinced the coast was in the wrong direction. So he turned the whole group the wrong way, out toward open ocean. As the weather closed in and the light faded, the radio calls got more and more confused, and then they stopped. And just like that, all 14 men were gone. A seaplane went up to look for them with 13 rescuers on board. It vanished too, off the radar within about 20 minutes of takeoff. A passing tanker reported flames on the water near its last position. That model had a habit of leaking fuel vapor, so most people think it simply blew apart in the air. The search that followed covered thousands of square miles and found nothing. No bodies, no wreckage, not one seat cushion. At the time, it was one of the biggest sea searches ever run. This is the flight that gave us the legend of the Bermuda Triangle. To some people, that stretch of ocean between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico is a place where the normal rules stop working. To others, it's just a big, busy patch of sea where the odds catch up with people, no different from anywhere else. The numbers back the second view. Planes and ships don't go missing there any more often than they do over water of the same size. Still, the most likely story is a hard one. A trusted officer lost his bearings, led his men the wrong way, and ran the tanks dry over dark water at night. No mystery force needed, just a broken compass and the open sea. 80 years later, the planes still haven't been found, so the case is technically still open. The men of Flight 19 didn't choose to disappear. The next man on this list chose it on purpose.
He was the first man in U.S. history to hijack a plane for ransom. He leapt out of a commercial jet. Who was D.B. Cooper?
I think he was just a sleazy, rotten criminal.
Chapter 3. The Man Who Jumped On. November 24th, 1971. The day before Thanksgiving, a man in a dark suit bought a one-way ticket in Portland under the name Dan Cooper. He took his seat on the flight to Seattle, ordered a bourbon and soda, and handed a flight attendant a note. It said he had a bomb. He opened a briefcase just far enough to show a tangle of wires and red sticks, and then he told her what he wanted: $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. He had it planned down to the detail. He asked for the cash in 20s, and for the plane to be fueled and ready before he'd let anyone off. And the airline paid. When they landed in Seattle, Cooper let all 36 passengers go in exchange for the money and the chutes. He kept a few crew on board and told them to fly toward Mexico City. Then, somewhere over the forests of the Pacific Northwest, a little after 8 p.m., he lowered the rear stairs, stepped out into the dark, and jumped. The plane landed safely. Cooper was never seen again. The FBI worked the case for decades, and it became one of the longest in the Bureau's history. Agents ran down more than 800 suspects. One of them, Richard McCoy, pulled off a nearly identical hijacking a few months later, and he looked like a strong match, right up until his whereabouts that day ruled him out. Then, in 1980, a boy digging along the Columbia River found about $5,800 in rotting $20 bills. The serial numbers matched Cooper's ransom. It's still the only physical trace anyone has ever recovered. In 2016, the FBI finally set the case down and put its people on other work. The question it left behind is a plain one. A man robbed an airliner, jumped into a storm at night in a business suit, and either walked away clean or died in the trees, where nobody thought to look. To this day, it's the only unsolved hijacking in American aviation. Cooper stole a single jump. 2 men in Africa would try to steal the whole plane. Chapter 4. The Stolen Jet. A Boeing 727 is not something you can slip into your pocket. It needs a trained crew of 3, a runway, and the tower's permission to move. On May 25, 2003, at the airport in Luanda, Angola, none of that stopped 2 men from taking one. The jet had flown for American Airlines for 25 years before it ended up grounded in Angola, parked on the tarmac for over a year while the unpaid fees piled up. That evening, close to sunset, Ben Padilla, an American mechanic and pilot, got on board with a hired helper named John Mutantu. Neither of them was certified to fly a 727. The plane started to taxi without a word to the tower, swung onto the runway with no clearance, and lifted off with its lights dark, heading straight out over the Atlantic. And then it was gone. The FBI and CIA searched for it across whole continents and came back with nothing. No debris ever washed up. No wreck was ever found. The owner had a record of financial fraud, which fed one theory that the whole thing was a scheme gone wrong. Padilla's own family feared he'd crashed at sea or been forced to fly it against his will. A full investigation years later couldn't reach any conclusion at all. What you're left with is a fact that sounds impossible in a world of radar and satellites. A full-size airliner rolled down a runway, climbed into the evening, and left behind no wreck, no wire, no body. It's one of the largest aircraft ever to vanish without a trace. 2 men and a 90-ton jet. Just gone. That plane took a tail number off the register. The most famous disappearance of all took a name the whole world knew. Chapter 5. The Lost Aviator. By 1937, Amelia Earhart was one of the most famous people alive. She was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, and she was most of the way around the world. On July 2nd that year, she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, took off from Lae, New Guinea, aiming for a tiny speck of land in the Pacific called Howland Island. The target was barely a mile long, with thousands of miles of open ocean on every side. They had to fly straight to it. They never got there. Her last clear radio calls said she was low on fuel and couldn't find the island. Then the transmission stopped. The Navy ran the biggest sea search in its history up to that point, and it turned up nothing. She was declared dead in 1939. The official finding is the plainest one. She ran out of gas, went down in deep water near Howland, and was never found. Other people think she turned south and set down on an empty reef, then lived for a while as a castaway before she died there. A search party in 1940 did find a partial skeleton, judged more likely female than male. A woman's shoe and a jar of American face cream turned up nearby, too. A third group argues she drifted north and got captured by Japanese forces. Expedition after expedition has gone looking, and the sonar keeps coming back empty. Nearly 90 years later, no confirmed piece of her plane has ever come out of that part of the Pacific. The most documented pilot of her time flew into a clear morning and was never accounted for again. Disappearing almost always ends one way, but one woman fell out of the sky and lived to talk about it.
News tonight, a Malaysia Airlines flight
MH370.
Flight MH370
disappeared en route to Beijing.
70, we are ready. Requesting flight number 310 to Beijing. Malaysia 370.
Flight MH370.
Chapter 5. The plane, the world, kept looking for everything so far, happened in a world without much watching from above. The next one didn't. It's the one you were probably already thinking about. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 left Kuala Lumpur for Beijing, a routine overnight hop of about 6 hours. There were 239 people on board, most of them heading home to China. About 40 minutes in, the transponder switched off, and the plane dropped out of civilian radar. Military radar caught it doing something no one expected. It turned hard, back across the Malay Peninsula, and then it swung south, out over the Indian Ocean. Then the signals stopped for good. This wasn't 1955 or 1937. This was a modern jet, tracked by satellites in an age when your phone always knows exactly where you are, and a Boeing 777, one of the biggest passenger jets in the sky with 239 people inside, simply vanished. Despite the largest search in aviation history, it has never been found. The searches have been staggering. Australia, China, and Malaysia spent years and roughly $130 million combing the seafloor. In 2015, a piece of a wing washed up on a beach on Réunion Island, thousands of miles from where it took off. A few more fragments turned up on other shores. Private crews went back out in 2018, and again in 2025, with the most advanced deep-sea drones ever built. They came back with nothing. More than a decade later, the families still don't have an answer. A full airliner vanished in the satellite age, and almost none of it has ever been recovered. If a plane like that can disappear now, the older cases start to feel a little less impossible. The most famous disappearance of all took a name the whole world knew. Chapter 6. The Longest Fall. On January 26, 1972, a Yugoslav airliner was cruising over Czechoslovakia when a bomb in the baggage hold tore it into 3 pieces. Everyone on board was thrown into the freezing air and fell. Everyone except Vesna Vulovic, a 23-year-old flight attendant who wasn't even supposed to be on that flight. A mix-up with another woman who had the same first name had put her on the plane. She fell inside the tail section from around 33,000 feet, higher than most planes ever climb. She holds the record for the highest fall anyone has ever survived without a parachute, and nobody has taken it from her since. She was pinned behind a food cart when the plane came apart, which kept her from getting thrown out with everyone else. The tail dropped onto a snow-covered mountainside, and the trees and deep snow softened what should have been the end. Doctors later said her low blood pressure was part of it. It kept her heart from bursting on impact. By every rule of physics, she should have died in the air with the rest of them. She didn't. She spent close to a month in a coma and months more in the hospital, with a fractured skull, broken legs, and a broken back. Then she recovered, and she asked for her old job back. Years later, 2 journalists questioned the official altitude, arguing the plane broke apart far lower than the record says. The record keepers looked at it and let her title stand. To some, it's the greatest fall anyone has ever walked away from. To others, it's a Cold War story worth a second look. Either way, one fact holds. A woman fell from near the top of the sky and was alive at the bottom. She survived on luck, on where she was standing, and on snow. A teenager would survive somewhere nobody is meant to breathe at all. Chapter 7. The Boy in the Wheel Well. The space where a jet's landing gear folds up is not built for a person. At cruising height, there's almost no oxygen, and the cold drops far below freezing, low enough to kill you in minutes. In April 2014, a 15-year-old climbed into one anyway. He'd run away from his home near San Jose, California, after a fight with his family. He hopped an airport fence and picked a Hawaiian Airlines jet more or less at random. When it took off for Maui, he was riding in the front wheel well. The flight ran about 5.5 hours, cruising near 38,000 feet. He had no coat and no gloves, just the clothes he ran away in. He blacked out early and stayed out for almost the whole trip. An hour after landing, a stunned ground crew watched him drop out of the wheel well and wander across the tarmac. Dazed, but alive. Doctors think the cold is actually what saved him. His body most likely dropped into something close to hibernation. His heart slowed to a crawl, and his cells needed almost no oxygen. It's the same reason some people survive falling into freezing water and come back. That's about the only way anyone survives up there. Officials were blunt about the odds. Most people who try this die, crushed by the gear, or gone from the cold long before the plane ever lands. He walked away with a story almost nobody else on Earth can tell. He rode on the outside of the cabin, higher than the top of Everest, and he lived. The sky isn't the only place people disappear, though. The sea has been doing this far longer, and it leaves even less behind. Chapter 8. The Empty Ship. In December 1872, a British ship crossing the Atlantic came across another vessel moving strangely, its sails half set, and no one at the wheel. It was an American brigantine called the Mary Celeste. She'd left New York a month earlier, bound for Italy, carrying Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, and 7 crew. When a boarding party climbed aboard, they found her in good shape. The cargo, 1,701 barrels of alcohol, sat mostly untouched. There was food and water for 6 months. The crew's belongings were still sitting in their bunks, but every single person was gone. The only lifeboat was missing, and one of the ship's pumps lay taken apart on the deck, with a few feet of water in the hold below. Nothing pointed to a fight. There was no blood, no damage, no sign of pirates. So why would 10 people abandon a solid ship in the middle of the ocean? The steadiest answer starts with that water in the hold. The captain may have been afraid the ship was flooding, or about to blow with alcohol fumes building up. So he ordered everyone into the lifeboat to wait it out, tied to the ship by a line. If that line snapped in rough seas, the little boat would have drifted off and swamped, and the ship herself sailed on without them, and proved him wrong by staying afloat for years. It's a good theory. It's also just a theory. The 10 people who left were never found, and the ship kept drifting on her course for days with no hand on the wheel. The ghost ship kept sailing, and the mystery still hasn't been solved more than 150 years later. Sometimes the thing that unsettles you is what's missing from a scene, and sometimes it's what shouldn't be there at all. Chapter 9. Lights that followed. In the winter of 1944, Allied pilots flying night missions over Europe started reporting the same strange thing. Balls of light, red and orange and white, would slide up next to their planes and just sit there. They matched every turn the pilots made. Then they'd peel off at a speed nothing built back then could touch. Radar showed empty sky. The lights were only ever seen, never tracked, and the reports kept piling up through December and into the new year. The crews of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron took the name for them from a newspaper comic strip, where a firefighter liked to say that where there's foo, there's fire. So they called them Foo Fighters, and the name spread across the whole front. At first, the fear was obvious. These had to be some new German weapon sent up to rattle Allied crews before the real blow landed. That idea never held up. German and Japanese pilots were seeing the lights too, and no weapon ever turned up to match them. So calmer explanations came next. Some people pointed to St. Elmo's fire, the glow that builds on wingtips and masts in a charged sky, though the color and the movement never really fit. Others reached for ball lightning, which science still can't fully pin down. Cold, static electricity, plane exhaustion, tricks of the eye. They all took a turn as the answer. None of them closed the case. A panel of scientists went through the reports after the war and just left them sitting there, unsolved. Thousands of trained airmen on both sides of the fighting watched the same lights and came home without an explanation. Whatever those lights were, they were real enough that hardened pilots wrote them down and never forgot them. Which brings us right back to where we started, and to a flight that was never real at all. The truth it borrowed. Pan Am Flight 914 never left the ground because it never existed. A tabloid made it up. The internet dressed it up as real footage, and millions of people believed a plane had slipped through time. The lie worked for one reason. It sat on top of something true. Real planes take off and are never seen again. Real ships turn up empty with the table still set. People fall from the top of the sky and live. Others ride where no body should survive and still walk away. A kid steps off into the dark over a forest and is never found again. The made-up flight promised a tidy ending, a calendar on the runway, a mystery all wrapped up. The real stories don't do that. They hand you the disappearance and keep the answer for themselves. That's what the hoax got wrong. It figured the impossible needed inventing. It didn't. The truth had already done it and left every question wide open. No calendar on the runway, just the empty space where a plane or a ship or a person used to be.